11. First Corinthians chapter 11. Well, there. All right, let's pray. Father, we come to you this morning, and Lord, we come with a grateful heart as we think of what this day commemorates. And Lord, we know we're here and can meet freely because somebody died centuries ago, decades ago, days ago. And Father, we are so grateful for the sacrifices that have been made, that we have a country that's free. And we're grateful for the sacrifices that are made, that we have a faith, and we have a Bible, and we have a continued existence. And we thank you most of all for what was accomplished at Calvary. So Lord, I pray you'd bless our service this morning. I'm just a piece of dirt standing behind this pulpit. Without you, I can't do anything, and my flesh dwells no good thing, just a piece of dirt. Clay vessel. And pray, Father, that you will take this clay vessel and fill it with your spirit, your passion, your power, your words, your wisdom, and whatever else you need to communicate to your people this morning. Lord, help us to remember. Help us to remember as we look back. Help us to remember what sacrifices were made that we might be where we are today. Father, bless the service. Move up and down these aisles, sit next to each and every one of us. But Lord, we beseech you that you'd minister to us. We need to hear from heaven. We don't want to hear from me. We don't want to hear from anything else. We want to hear from heaven. And so, Father, speak to us. I ask it in Christ's name. Amen. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. I had you turn there. And we're going to look at verse 24. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And looking at verse 24. It says, "And when he had given thanks, he brake it, and said, Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. And after the same manner also he took the cup when he had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do as oft as you drink it in remembrance of me." Today is a day of remembrance. This is the Memorial Day weekend. And this is not Veterans Day. On Veterans Day, we celebrate those who put on the uniform, who went overseas or at least went into a position of being possibly putting their life on the line, some having putting their life at risk, serving in foreign fields, wherever they may be, and came home. But this is Memorial Day. Memorial Day is about those who have paid the ultimate price, that put on the uniform, that went overseas, and never came home. And so this is a day of remembrance. This is not an anniversary. An anniversary is just a date. Actually, anniversary comes from the Latin annus, meaning year, and versus, meaning turning. So an anniversary is when you take a date and it turns all the way around and comes back to that same date. But that's all an anniversary is a date. A memorial is a different thing. A memorial is something. Sometimes it's a structure that's been built, established to remind people of a person or event, synonymous with the word remembrance. The event is usually something of a profound nature. So profound it involved a sacrifice. Sometimes the ultimate sacrifice, usually in the context of war. And normally with a memorial in such a profound nature, there will be epitaphs that have risen up from that particular memorial, or commemorations relating to such sacrifices. On May 3rd, 1915, after the Second Battle of Ypres, which is in Belgium, it's spelled Y-P-R-E-S, Ypres, French word. The Allies referred to it as wipers because it looks more like it would spell the word wipers. And it was in Western Belgium that a Canadian physician, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, was inspired to write what became the most inspirational poem of that era. Described by McCrae as a nightmare, the Battle of Ypres, or Wipers, was the first time chemical weapons were used as the Germans attacked the Canadian position with chlorine gas. He went on to say, quote, "In all that time while I was awake, gunfire and rifle fire never ceased for 60 seconds. And behind it all was the constant background of the sights of the dead, the wounded, the maimed, and a terrible anxiety lest the line should give way." It's World War I. McCrae had a close friend by the name of Alexis Helmer, and he would see his friend die in this battle. McCrae would perform the burial services, at which time he noted how poppies grew quickly around the graves of those who died at Wipers. The next day he composed the poem while sitting in the back of an ambulance at an advanced dressing station outside of Wipers. That poem, which I'm sure you've heard time and again, that poem is called "In Flanders Fields." And according to historian Paul Fussell, the most popular poem of its era. It may be the most well-known literary piece among English Canadians. And it's written from the perspective of the dead. And it goes like this: "In Flanders fields the poppies grow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky the larks sing bravely, are still bravely singing, fly scarce heard among the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields." This well-known poem, in fact, part of it, a phrase from it, is used in the dressing room for the Montreal Canadiens hockey team. The third stanza that says, "To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high." I remember as a child, during this day, the old guys would be out there in their uniforms. And I'm not sure how many World War I old guys we have left anymore. Probably not, probably a handful somewhere. But when I was younger, there were a few of them. And they would go out and they'd sell the poppies. I never knew why they sold poppies until I did the history of this. And that poppy became what commemorated World War I. You know, when we talk about World War II, and excuse me if I'm a little bit of a history buff, I love this kind of stuff. But in World War II, we talked about the European theater and the Pacific theater. And when you say to the average American, Pacific theater, our thoughts are Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Japan, Philippines. If you ask the average American, did we ever fight in India, or was any part of World War II ever fought in India? And they'll look at you like, India? Was any American ever fighting in Southeast Asia at that time? Well, there was a group called Merrill's Marauders. They were the beginning, if you will, of the Army Rangers. But for the British, there were two battles. The Battle of Kohima and the Battle of Imphal. The Japanese had already advanced through China and were now setting their sights on Burma and India. Kohima, however, would be fought by the British and Indian troops of the Fourth Corps. This battle had been called, or has been called, the Stalingrad of the East. The British troops would secure and built up the city of Kohima and Imphal, knowing the Japanese were coming, and were determined at whatever cost to stop the advancement of the Japanese army. In 2013, the British National Army Museum voted the Battle of Imphal and Kohima to be Britain's greatest battle. How many of you ever heard of those two places? These are Britain's greatest battles. The Japanese would ultimately lose this battle because of lack of supplies, primarily food. You see, the Japanese had this idea that the British didn't know how to fight in the jungle. And so they figured if we can just get there, we'll beat them and we'll take their supplies. So they only brought with them 30 days of supplies, figuring this isn't going to be hard. They didn't realize and underestimated the resolve of the Brits and the Indians to stop them. There is located at this famous battle site the War Cemetery of Kohima. And the cemetery lies on the slopes of Garrison Hill at what was once the Deputy Commissioner's tennis court. A memorial stands erected to honor the 1,420 Allied dead. And engraved on the front of this memorial are the words of John Maxwell Edmonds. And these words have become world famous as the Kohima epitaph. And again, from the perspective of the dead, it says this, quote, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today." And that statement kind of sums up the idea of Memorial Day. When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. We have a pastor friend in Lecanto, Florida, who we'll probably never see again because now he's 2,500 miles away. But his son, Larry, was an Iraqi war veteran. And we were there one time, and I noticed a bumper sticker on the back of his SUV, and I'd never seen this bumper sticker before, and I have only seen it once or twice. Somebody around here has this bumper sticker. I said to Larry, I said, "Did you come up with that?" He said, "I may have." He said, that was the thought that came to my mind, and had a bumper sticker made. And the bumper sticker said this: "There are only two defining forces that ever died for you, Jesus Christ and the American soldier."
Wow.
Now we could add to that, so there's three defining forces: the American soldier, Jesus Christ, the American soldier, and the first responders.
Yeah.
But think about that.
Yeah.
In the early part of 1800s, 1836 to be exact, in Texas, there was a small mission building in the area of San Antonio.
Yes, sir.
And 200 Texans and others came to that mission building and were prepared to do the best they could to stop the Mexican advance. 2,500, if I remember correctly, oh, I'm sorry, more than that. I don't know, in the thousands of Mexican soldiers under the leadership of Santa Anna would be coming. And these men determined to hold out as long as they could at a place called the Alamo. Hoping that Sam Houston would get there in time with reinforcements, but he never made it. And so from February 23rd to March 6th, they held out, under siege, under attack after attack after attack by the Mexican troops, to finally the death of James Bowie, William Travis, and Davy Crockett. And the Alamo was taken. You say, how do you know about the Alamo if everybody died? There were servants in there that didn't die, who later told the story of how these men died. And from this loss, this horrific loss, came the cry, "Remember the Alamo." And that became the moral cause. Remember the Alamo. In fact, even in the Spanish-American War, they would say, "Remember the Alamo," marking the sacrificial death of these men. You know, Jesus said in John 15, verse 12, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." And This is Memorial Day weekend, a time to remember those that paid the ultimate price. What I'd like to do this morning is give you 5 things I believe American Christians need to remember about this holiday. Number 1, America is the only nation in the history of the world that has religious freedom.
Amen.
Now let me explain that. Let me explain that.
Come on.
You say, come on now, preacher. England had what was called the Toleration Act. In other words, they found a way to tolerate the dissidents. I'll talk more about that as we go. Soviet Union, if you read their constitution, said freedom of religion. Chairman Mao said freedom of religion. So what's the difference? Let me tell you what the difference is. The First Amendment doesn't just say or speak about freedom of religion. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or, and here's the key, prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The Soviet Union said you're free to worship God however you want to do it, but just do it privately. Don't bring it out into the public sector, and if you do, we'll kill you. Which is basically what Chairman Mao said. Or any of these other places. England said, if you want to worship non-Anglican, you can do that, but you're going to be under our restrictions. North Korea, freedom of religion, as long as you do it exactly the way the state government says and you don't say anything about Jesus Christ, the Bible, or so on and so forth, you're free to worship. That's not freedom. The United States is the only country in the history of mankind that says not only do you have freedom of religion, but you've got the free exercise thereof. You can gather together. If you believe you need to sing, you can sing. If you believe you need to preach, you can preach. If you believe you need to propagate your religion, you can propagate your religion. Freedom, free exercise thereof. That's what makes the difference. So understand that just as we start out. This is a country, the only country in the history of mankind that has the free exercise thereof. Secondly, America's here because of the direct providence of God.
Amen.
You know, it's amazing when you think about it, all the things that went on in Europe and other places in the world. China. I was reading the other day where the Chinese, they had an admiral that was building these great ships, and they wanted to cross over the Pacific to see what was there. And one of the emperors said, we're not going to do that, and had all the ships destroyed. Here's the North American continent, sandwiched between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean with just a bunch of ice at the top, that seems to have been reserved for a coming time. Oh, we had Native Americans here. We know the Native Americans crossed over from Far East Asia, crossed the Bering Straits, came into North America, Central America, South America. But it is interesting that while South America and Central America had the Aztecs and the Incas and the Olmecs and these great civilizations, you don't find any of that in North America. It's as if that property had been reserved for a time coming. And I believe God did that. You say, come on now, preacher. You're going to tell me that God has something to do with America. Yeah, I'm going to tell you that. I'm going to tell you that.
Yes, he does. Every bit of it.
And the secularists will tell you that there was nothing to do, the establishment of this country had nothing to do with religion. God doing anything in this country was just a coincidence. God had nothing to do with it. Well, I disagree with you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
But I'm nobody. Really, I'm nobody. I'll tell you else who would disagree with you. And that's George Washington himself.
Yeah.
Yes. Come on.
Now, you can run your mouth all you want about God having nothing to do with anything. I'm going to listen to what a man who was there said about the providence of God. He said this in 1778. The providence of God has been so conspicuous, not inconspicuous, conspicuous, that he who has no faith must be worse than an infidel. Such a one would be worse than wicked because he will not acknowledge his obligation of gratitude to God.
Yeah.
You say, well, he's just shooting his mouth out. Washington was a guy that lived in the providence of God.
Yeah. Amen.
I believe I've told you before about the time Washington had a meeting with some elderly Native Americans who, in the conversation, went back to the time when Washington was just a young, I believe, 22-year-old colonel. And he was fighting with the British against the French and the Indians. And the leaders were the ones on horseback. The British fighting the way they fought, they would have their leaders on horseback while their troops were marching, and they would try to encourage the troops. The Indians figured out, if we shoot the guy on the horse, we'll probably get the rest of them to run away. And I forget which general was in front of Washington. It might have been Howe. Was shot to death. And Washington was the next one up. And so he began to encourage the troops. And when the battle was over, now Washington had 2 horses shot out from underneath him. He had his hat shot off. But when that battle was over and he took his coat off, there were 4 bullet holes in his coat. He wasn't touched. Those elderly Indians at that meeting later on said to him, we were there. And we ordered our warriors to shoot you. And our warriors knew how to shoot. And we shot you. And you didn't feel a bit. He said, from that point on, we knew you were the great leader. The great white spirit, or whatever they called him. Washington lived in the providence of God.
Amen.
They talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was actually fought on Breed's Hill. And he said, why do they call it the Battle of Bunker Hill? Because there was some old preacher that was on the top of that hill that spent his night and day in prayer while the battle was going on over here.
How about that?
And the secular historians will say the British made a mistake. Don't know why. Don't understand why they made this mistake. But you know what the mistake they made was? They brought cannons that shot 12-pound and 9-pound cannonballs. They brought the 12-pound cannonballs that didn't fit. Just a coincidence. We talked about the Battle of Boston. And Washington was going to take Boston, and they didn't have any artillery. Henry Knox said, we've taken Fort Ticonderoga. Let me take a group up there. We'll get the artillery that's left there and bring it back. 300-mile trek. So Knox made this incredible trip, and on the way back, it was called the artillery train. So as the artillery is arriving, Washington is praying for fog. And just coincidentally, the fog, heavy fog, settles in over the harbor. And the British can't see anything that's going on. And the artillery, to get it up the hill where they were, is going to be really tough because the ground was mud. It was melting in the wintertime. And yet, for some unknown reason, that particular night it got very, very cold. Enough for the ground to freeze so they could roll the artillery up to the top of the hill. During that nighttime also, they realized we have no defense. And the day before that, if I remember correctly, there was a young man who had a background in engineering, happened to be in the tent of one of the generals, noticed on his books, he had a little bookshelf he carried with him. One of those books had to do with military engineering, which he saw engineering and thought, wow, I gotta read that. So he took that book, and the first page he opened up to a picture and the description of what were called chandeliers, not the hanging lights, but a chandelier. A chandelier are 4 poles basically in the ground, and then you stack logs in that, and then you cover it with dirt. They built those all the way around for their fortification. And you could do it easily, and you could do it quickly, and it would stop a cannonball, and it would stop musket balls. The next day, when the fog had lifted, and the battle was about to begin, the British commander looked up, looked at all those chandeliers, and he said this, quote, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." And of course, they accomplished what they desired to accomplish. December 26th, in Trenton, Washington would have a surprise attack upon not the British, but the Hessians. They were the mercenaries. You could hire them for war. And so the Hessians had been defeating Washington in various places. But on December 26th, Washington invaded where they were encamped. And he invaded on the 26th, the morning of the 26th, because he knew what they were going to do the 25th. They weren't holding church services. They were partying. One report was there were over 300 prostitutes as part of the camp. And Washington knew what was going on. And he said, if we're going to strike them, that would be the time to go.
Yes, sir.
Here's the amazing thing. A scout saw Washington's troops. He saw them lined up, ready to come. And he went running to the commander, the 25th, went running to the commander and said, Washington's guys are just outside. They're just over there. They're going to come. And nobody knows why the Hessian commander didn't listen to that. We know why it is. So I believe the United States of America was founded providentially by the grace of God. And you're here today because God said, you know what? I've got this place called North America.
Yeah.
Thirdly, there would be no America had not the European Christians sacrificed their lives, because the pilgrims came from Europe. You think about Europe during the time of the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, and one of the biggest atrocities in Europe at that time, something called the Inquisition. And the Inquisition was led by the Jesuits, the Roman Catholic priests called Jesuits. The Jesuits are the bad guys of Catholicism. And for so long, Catholics didn't want to admit they were Jesuit. And then I remember in the 70s, I started seeing things show up. We had in Toledo 2 schools, Jesu, which changed its name to Jesu Jesuit School. St. John's High School, St. John's Jesuit High School. Suddenly they're bringing out the name Jesuit, and they're not afraid to say that. And I'm thinking because Americans are so stupid, they don't know the history of what was going on. And, you know, I mean, the average American knows what Hollywood slut married what other Hollywood slut, what have you, but when it comes to knowing things they need to know, they don't know. But in those dark ages, believers like the Waldensians, Albigenses, Cathari, Huguenots, etc., believers just like us for the most part, who believed in the Bible and believed in worshiping Jesus Christ, were hated by the Roman Catholic Church. And so the Inquisitions began, and Christians, wherever they were found, would be arrested. And they had 2 favorite means of torture, and I don't mean to gross anybody out this morning, but I just want you to understand where you came from. They had one thing called a strappado. A strappado was simply tying somebody's hands behind their back, and then you throw a rope over the beam, or you had a pulley up there, and you bring the rope down and tie it to the hands that are tied behind the back, and then just slowly start to lift. Now, I appreciate that, and I know Walter appreciates that, and any of you here that had rotator cuff issues would appreciate what's going on here, because you know what's going to happen. I mean, you can stiffen up as much as you want, but eventually you're going to give in. And sometimes they would jerk the rope, and eventually those arms would come up and dislocate. Sometimes they would hang weights from the feet, just to get that guy to recant. And the majority of them, the vast majority, would not recant. Some would recant, and then re-recant, and then they would be arrested again. And then they had what was called the rack, where they laid a person out and they tied their feet and their hands. There was a cylinder on both ends, and they would just begin to turn it. And they would turn it until things got dislocated, and turn it far enough where things began to become detached. That was going on in the Middle Ages. And the people we trace our history back to, as far as Baptists, were these people. And the Pilgrims were fleeing from the remnants of the Inquisition, fleeing from the persecution by the Anglican Church, fleeing from the wickedness of their day. They ended up going to Holland. I'm sure you know the story. But in Holland, they realized the society here, although it may be kind of friendly to us, the society here is ruining our children. There's no morality here.
Yeah.
That was one of the driving forces to get them out of there.
Yeah.
Interesting story. I heard Pastor Sowell give an interesting story one time about a Baptist church, a 1600s Baptist church, when they visited in England. And they went in and began to talk to the caretaker. And the caretaker began to tell the story about this church. First thing they wondered is, why is this church so far from the town? But the Anglicans said, or the caretaker said, the Anglicans would not allow a church within a 5-mile radius of the city. But he said, here's the interesting thing. This little church was built where 3 counties meet. And here's the reason. The Tolerance Act, remember we talked about that? The Tolerance Act said this: if you're going to worship, now see if this sounds familiar, you can only have 10 or 12 at one time. And so the people would come to gather for a worship service, and somebody around there would say, hey, they're worshiping again, run into town, tell the police, out they come. And when the police came out, the Baptist said, that's your county? This is not your county.
Yeah.
And they couldn't do it. And that's why they built that church right in that area. So they could worship. And if this crowd came, they would step into this county. You'd have to have police from all 3 counties to do something. And by then you could have 12 here, 12 here, and 12 there. There's always a way to do it, isn't there? But that's how they lived. So when the Pilgrims are coming to the United States, not only did they know what they wanted to do, they know what they came out of. I've told you before about the history of the Anabaptists, and one particular occasion they sent young men out to be missionaries. And 80% of them lost their lives. 80% of them were arrested, tortured, and put to death. Which means for every 100 they sent out, 20 would come back. And their biggest crime was that they believed the Bible, that they wanted the Bible in their own language. They didn't want the Catholic Church to control the reading of the Bible. They wanted to see it for themselves. This book we have right here, this book, you probably have 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 of them in your house.
Yeah.
Some of them are in your car. Some of them are packed away somewhere. Some of them are on your bookshelf. This book right here was contraband in the Middle Ages, as it is in North Korea today. If you own one of these books in North Korea, you're going to slave labor camp. If you own one of these books in the Middle Ages, or something like it, or somebody trying to translate it, you were in trouble. August 24th, 1572, there was an event called St. Bartholomew's Day in France. And from the 24th of August, several days after that, the French slaughtered 100,000 of their countrymen who were called Huguenots. So what does that mean? Bible believers. 10,000 in Paris alone. And then they would dump their bodies in the Seine River, the Rhone River, and different rivers in France. Historians say that they were stained with red from all the blood from the oozing corpses. Couldn't eat the fish out of there for months. And all the Huguenots wanted to do was what they call a participatory Christianity. We want to participate in this thing. We want a Bible just like the priest has. If he's going to teach us something, we want to see it in that book. We want to study it on our own. We want to see if what we're being taught is correct. That was their crime. And by the way, when word got back to Rome of the massacre of the Huguenots, Rome rejoiced and celebrated. I told you before about being at a meeting outside of Detroit. There's an old fellow there. He's gone now. His name was Jules Smith. He collected all the different old Bibles and what have you, and he had a display. He was at Larry Bartlett's church up there. Had a display from one end of the church to the other, just big table, all this stuff. So I went up there and I'm looking around and I picked up a pair of ankle bracelets. And he saw me look at it and said, "You know what those are?" Look like handcuffs to me. He said, "Well, they're ankle bracelets, handcuffs for the ankles." He said, "We found those. Those are from a dig in England where they burned Christians at the stake." So I thought that was just in Rome. No, it was good old Merry England. They burned Christians at the stake, and he said they'd secure their ankles and their hands and pile the sticks of wood around. You know what the sticks of wood around them were called? Faggots. They'd pile the sticks of wood around them up to their waist, set it on fire. England. That's what our pilgrim forefathers were dealing with.
Yeah.
So they said, "We need to get out of here." And just by coincidence, God had reserved a place called North America. Listen to me. There would be no European Christians had not the early Christians sacrificed their lives. Do you good sometime to read of the history of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century Christians. What life was like under Nero, and Caligula, and Diocletian, and the other emperors. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1. First Peter chapter 1, Peter's admonishing the brethren. And he says in verse 6, "Wherein ye greatly rejoice, though now for a season, if need be, ye are in heaviness through manifold temptations." Just stop and think about that. He said, "You greatly rejoice, but they're in heaviness and manifold temptation."
Yeah.
Now, how does that work? Spiritually, they knew where they were going. Spiritually, they knew their sins were forgiven. They were on their way to heaven. Physically, they knew they were going to be persecuted for their faith. Verse 7, "That the trial of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire,
Yeah.
Yeah.
might be found in the praise and honor and glory at the appearing
Yeah.
of Jesus Christ." Fiery trial. Literally, when Nero was the emperor, Rome, the city of Rome, had a great fire. If I remember correctly, it was either 2/3 or 3/4 of the city of Rome burned down, kind of like the Great Chicago Fire. And everybody was upset. They were upset with Nero, so Nero had to find a scapegoat. And he said, "You know what? It's those Christians. It's those Christians." And so he began persecuting Christians. And historians will tell you that around his garden, he had Christians impaled, covered with tar, and set on fire for light. And when the people saw him do stuff like that, they began to become sympathetic toward the Christians. But you're in Rome. You're in Rome. You're not going to say, "You know what, in a couple of years, we're going to vote this guy out." They're in Rome. Nothing you can do about that. But that's what some of our brethren went through to carry the faith. I've told you before, read Fox's Book of Martyrs at some point, or just a segment of it. Martyr's Mirror, that great big thick book, I've got one in my office. Just read some pages, 3 or 4 or 5 pages from that sometime. Get an idea of what people went through so you could have a Bible. What people went through so you could have the faith. What they went through so you could worship God.
Yeah.
Read about it.
Amen. Yep.
But understand this. There'd be no Christians had not Jesus Christ sacrificed his life at Calvary.
Yes, sir.
And he is the ultimate memorial.
Yeah. Yep.
We read 1 Corinthians 11, verse 24. It says this, "When he gave thanks, he brake it." This is the Last Supper. When he gave thanks, had given thanks, he brake it, the bread, said, "Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me."
Right now.
So the bread and the fruit of the vine are the memorials. We've talked about the poppies and the other epitaphs for the Christian. The bread and the fruit of the vine is the memorial
Yeah.
of the war between good and evil.
Yeah.
And the two most important words I'm looking at in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 24 are two little words. For you.
Yeah.
For you.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ did that for you.
Good, preacher. It's good.
And set the example.
Yes, sir.
So on a day like today, which is a memorial, a day which means remember, people have a tendency to forget. Psalm 9 and verse 17 says, "The wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations and forget God." Psalm 78 verse 7, "That they might set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments." Psalm 103:2, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits." Hosea 4 and verse 6, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Boy, that's an understatement. "Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me, seeing thou hast forgotten the law of God. I will also watch it, forget thy children." You know why America's in trouble today? America's forgotten.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking about the military aspect of it. I'm talking about the very reason why we exist in North America.
Yeah.
Forgotten. It all began at Calvary. For our nation, for the world, and for you. It began at Calvary. And this faith was died for in various places in the Roman Empire. The Colosseum, the theaters. It was died for in Europe during the Middle Ages at the hands of the Roman Catholics and others, and Muslims. And in the establishment of our country, many Christians died for what became the United States of America. I'll leave you with two thoughts this morning. Just something to think about. Number one, I've heard folks talk. I remember my grandma talking about December 8th, 1941. He said, "Preacher, Pearl Harbor Day was December 7th. I know that. I'm talking about December 8th, the Monday that followed the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And there are accounts of young men lined up to enlist at least 4 miles long,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
who understood the necessity of paying the debt for the nation.
Amen.
And these are young men whose fathers, uncles, grandfathers had gone into World War I. They had heard this all their life. They heard of the horrors that they went through in World War I.
Yeah.
But they understood there's a debt that has to be paid.
Yeah.
And so they lined up to enlist.
Yeah. Amen.
Some as young as 15 years old, trying to get in because they wanted to fight for their country. Young men that had the same dreams that our young men have. There were young men in that lineup that thought, I'm going to make an impact in the business community. There are some that had a future in sports. There are some that wanted to have a wife and wanted to have a family and wanted to see their children succeed, to want to walk their daughters down the aisle. Same desires that we have. But they understood there's something a little higher. And that's the debt to pay for your nation. We can talk about the Carnegies, and we can talk about J.P. Morgan, and we can talk about Rockefeller, and we can talk about Edison, we can talk about Ford, we can talk about Jobs, we can talk about Gates, we can talk about Elon Musk, we can talk about all these guys. They have nothing
Amen.
had not men and ladies laid down their lives to ensure the freedom of our country.
That's correct, preacher. That's correct.
So there's a debt we owe. Say, preacher, what am I supposed to do? Go out and enlist? What I'm telling you to do is this. If they fought for your rights, for crying out loud, use them.
Yeah.
Yeah, amen. How about that?
I've told you before, we were preaching in downtown Toledo one time on Thanksgiving Day parade, and some woman walks up to me and said, "What gives you the right to stand here?" I said, "I'll tell you what gives me the right. I had 2 uncles in World War II. I had another one in Korea. I had a cousin in Vietnam who were willing to put on the uniform and fight for the freedom and the rights to do this. That's what gives me the right.
Yeah.
And if they're going to put their life on the line, fortunately they all came home, if they're going to put their lives on the line for my freedom, for heaven's sakes, lady, I'm going to use the freedom."
Yeah, amen.
Excuse me if I get a little emotional.
All right.
Secondly, this holiday marks the beginning of summer, which around here is, oh no. We like Labor Day, that marks the beginning of fall. Let's get those temperatures under 3 digits, amen. But around the rest of the country, this holiday marks the beginning of summer. Day to rest, relax, at the cookout, play softball, volleyball, just hang around. It's a day off work for most people. But for some people, it's a dreaded holiday. For some people, all the talk of dying for your country, and all the talk about some gave all gave some. For some, it reopens a wound in their heart that they've spent the year trying to heal and never will. Because for some, they don't remember the cookouts and the volleyball game and the softball game. They remember 2 officers walking up their front door
Yeah.
and knocking on the front door and opening that front door and inviting them in. And they knew. They looked at their faces and they knew. Then one would open up a letter and begin to read with our deepest regrets. Your son has died in battle. Or your daughter has died in battle. And so they don't really like this holiday because it brings up so many tears, heartaches. They're going to put burgers on, maybe, hot dogs, but for them, it'll always be one less. One less. And let me say this. For you ladies that think your husband's a buffoon, and most husbands are,
Amen. Come on, man. You're right.
you think your husband's a buffoon, can I tell you this? There are women all across this country that would love to have a buffoon. But he's buried on the western shores of France, or in Germany, on an island somewhere in the Pacific, or on a peninsula in Korea, jungles of Vietnam, sandy deserts of Kuwait, Iraq. Yeah, they'd love to have a buffoon. But their husband gave the ultimate price for this country. Memorial Day. Memorial Day. Remember that while we sit here and have a good time, and we'll have a good time, somebody paid for that.
Sure they do, preacher. That's right.
You know, we fuss about this COVID-19 stuff. We have to try to limit the seating and the social distancing and all that stuff. Thank God we can do that.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Amen.
you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today.
Yeah.
No greater love has this, a man laid down his life for his friends.
Yes, sir.
Father, we thank you this morning for Jesus. We are so grateful, Father, for his death at Calvary, his resurrection from the dead, the forgiveness of sin, the new life, the promise of a home